Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining me today. I've called this the Studio Q Show. My name is Quinn Jacobson, and I'm going to be reading the next to last chapter of the book, The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. And today there's a very interesting chapter, chapter 10, called Cracks in the Shields. And this is the authors delve into some potential or actually very thought-provoking ideas around mental illness. And we'll take a quick look at this kind of overview. Let me share my little slideshow here, and we'll go over this real quick. So yeah, today is May 20th, believe it or not, 2023. This is The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. This is episode 10, chapter 10, Cracks in the Shields, and we have one more after this to finish off the book, and it'll be very interesting. I think you'll find it very interesting. So today, this chapter, the sub-chapters in it are schizophrenia, death defied, phobias and obsessions, death displaced, post-traumatic stress disorder, the shield shattered, depression, death visible, suicide, death enacted, alcohol and other drugs, death diffused, and mending the cracks in the shields. So yeah, good chapter, very interesting. If you have any interest in these mental health problems, I think this will, like I said, I think it'll give you some really good food for thought. Hello, Thilo. Hello. How are you doing? Good to see you. And Fred, good morning, Fred. Yes, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And Fred, I was thinking about you the other day. Chapter 11 has, it's kind of the summary of everything in this book. And it talks about older folks and how death anxiety and confronting mortality is a little different for a couple of groups of people. And I think you'll find that very interesting, Fred. And welcome, Linda from Stockholm, Sweden. I appreciate you being here. I think you guys will find this fascinating. There is talk about suicide. There isn't anything graphic necessarily. So, if you're sensitive to those kinds of things, there's nothing, I don't think anything that's really triggering, but just a forewarning that, they do talk about suicide in this chapter. As I've often spoke about this, as I go through the week, I'm constantly looking at information on this topic of death anxiety, denial of death, terror management, all those kinds of things. And I ran into this article, and you can find it on psych.co. This is written by Samir Chopra, and it's titled, I'm anxious, therefore I inquire. Anxiety isn't a problem to be solved. It drives philosophical inquiry and makes us human. This caught my eye because this is such in the spirit of Soren Kierkegaard. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing Kierkegaard. I know the Scandinavian Danish pronounce it a little different, but that's how we say it in English. Kierkegaard has the same kinds of ideas as this title of this article. I wanted to read you this real quick. Humans are philosophizing animals precisely because we are the anxious animal, not a creature of the present, but regretful about the past and fearful of the future. We philosophize to understand our past, to make our future more comprehensible. The unknown produces a distinctive unease. Inquiry and the material and psychic tools it yields provide relief. Where anxiety underwrites inquiry, we claim that the success of the inquiry removes anxiety and is pleasurably anticipated. Inquiry comes to an end when we're not anxious, but rather sated and blissful. There's no more to be said, answered, or understood. Understanding and enlightenment have been achieved. Philosophy is the path that we hope gets us there. Anxiety is our dogged, unpleasant, and indispensable companion. I thought that was pretty powerful. And it's right in line with today's chapter. Hello, Boguslav. Good to see you. Thanks for joining me. So let's get on to this. Let's get on to chapter 10 here, where we will waste no time. Let me stop that screen and jump over to this other screen, and we'll read chapter 10 here. This is good stuff. If you've ever wondered about mental illness, or I know there's a lot of causes, one of the, maybe another preface to this chapter is there's a lot of causes, right? There's different, biochemical and genetic and all kinds of stuff that can cause these things. But the authors lay out a very strong and compelling argument for some of the underpinning of the fear of death, death anxiety, and how terror is managed, and mental health issues are some of those ways we deal with that. So I'll let you decide here. Let's read this. Chapter 10, Cracks in the Shields. We may take for granted that the fear of death is always present in our mental functioning. For behind the sense of insecurity in the face of danger, behind the sense of discouragement and depression, there always lurks the basic fear of death, a fear which undergoes most complex elaborations and manifests itself in many indirect ways. The anxiety neurosis, the various phobic states, even a considerable number of depressive suicidal states, and many schizophrenias amply demonstrate the ever-present fear of death, which becomes woven into the major conflicts of the given psychopathological conditions. So basically, Gregory Zilborg, fear of death, basically he's laying out in that quote the very thing we're going to talk about. That quote is the underpinning mental health issues around this death anxiety. Pat, a third-year psychology student with curly brown hair, blue eyes, and an impish demeanor, was an exceptionally bright young man in his early 20s. One day, he bounded into my office with a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eyes. "I just wrote something I think you will appreciate," he said. He opened his journal and pointed to a passage that read, "People are anxiety-avoiding mechanisms, never reflecting. Why must they avoid anxiety? What is the source or cause of the anxiety they avoid so religiously? What are they afraid of? That they are afraid of truth is for certain, but the truth about what? Could it be that things are not what they appear to them to be? Could it be that they themselves are not what they think themselves to be?" Wow, those are pretty insightful musings, I told him. "You might be interested in taking some courses in personality theory or psychopathology." "Oh, no, I don't need to take courses like that," Pat said cheerfully. "I already know pretty much everything about psychology. My mission now is to make the world a better place, like Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, and Bruce Lee." "Bruce Lee?" I asked. "You mean the Chinese martial arts guy?" "Yes, that Bruce Lee," Pat responded. He went on to tell me that Lee gave him support and advice via messages transmitted through toasters and microwave ovens. At that point, I realized that Pat might be better off seeing a psychologist rather than studying to become one. I later learned that Pat had just spent time in the mental health unit of the local hospital, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. From then on, I often found Pat waiting outside my office to chat when I arrived at 7 a.m. Although Pat was disappointed that his coworkers at a local pizza parlor seemed oblivious to his great talents, he chalked this up to their ignorance. He remained confident that it was only a matter of time and continued guidance from JFK and Bruce Lee before he took his rightful place as commander of the universe. Pat eventually lost his job delivering pizzas after customers complained that they were more concerned about timely arrival of their dinner than affecting radical change in planetary conditions. Pat became increasingly agitated for a few weeks, and he looked especially disheveled when he appeared at my office one morning. He had been up all night collecting his thoughts, and he had written some more than 100 pages of disjointed prose, including the following: strange things, Ethel Kennedy, Emily, Warren and his dead brother's phone call, Neil and his question over the phone, "Are you paranoid?" When the telephone line went down, I knew what card my grandmother was going to throw down. When I was itching all over from the neck up. This paper is a recording of all strange things that have happened to me that I could not and would not make sense of. When I controlled the world through my TV, the thoughts that crossed my mind upon entering the mental health unit for the second time, the thoughts that were not my own when I left after the second time, avoiding the risk of possible spontaneous combustion, when voices occur saying, "Get the F out of my mind," and has never failed me. There are world leaders who know Pat. Ninja is after me. Shortly thereafter, Pat was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. 2 weeks later, Pat was back in my office, eager to share his journal entry reflecting on his experience at the mental health unit. For over a week, I had a state of mind where all things were possible. I felt the laws of nature could be defied. I will one day have a mind superior to JFK's and maybe of anyone ever. This, I feel, is a conservative goal. One key to such development is to be my own master of learning. There's going to be a surge of development in Pat like this world has never seen before in any individual. Perhaps I will never need the official platform of the presidency. Perhaps pen, paper, and lectures will be sufficient. As it is right now, the only thing preventing me from becoming president is the prejudice of the voters. I will no doubt be the man best qualified to handle the job. I feel it is just a matter of going through the motions. I feel no pressure. I feel no anxiety. For the next few years, Pat hopped from job to job and put in an occasional stint at various mental health facilities. At one point, he was doing quite well. He liked his job at a local factory, even though his coworkers failed to recognize his brilliance, and the president of the company didn't respond to Pat's repeated offers for a face-to-face meeting at corporate headquarters. Pat wanted to explain how some minor altercations in company procedures, including installing Pat as in an executive position, would be tremendously beneficial for the company, the country, and the world at large. Pat was quite surprised when he came to work one day and found he had been terminated. I was quite surprised that they had kept him so long. A few weeks after he lost his job, Pat's mother called to tell me that Pat had committed suicide. Pat left a note asking her to be sure to leave me his lamp, his books, and his favorite picture, a giant print of the 16th century Chinese landscape artist Yang Yin's Dreaming of Immortality in a Thatched Cottage, which we described in chapter 5. That's a partial rendering. You can look at that painting if you want to look it up. We don't think Pat's favorite picture was a coincidence, nor was his nickname for humans talking sausages. The worm at the core was gnawing away at Pat, as it does many suffering from schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. Psychological disorders are typically caused by a combination of factors, but there's no doubt that death anxiety plays a role in many of them. As long as people's twin shields against the fear of extinction, a view of life as meaningful and of themselves as valuable, are intact, they can live their lives with relatively minimal psychological turmoil. Yet some people, because of their genetic predispositions, biochemical imbalances, unfortunate upbringing, or other stressful life experiences, cannot successfully deploy these shields to quell their worries about death. So they try, often with admirable courage and imagination, to erect their own defenses. Unfortunately, these clumsy modes of dealing with terror, as the existential psychotherapist Irvin Yalom put it, often prove inadequate. Dread seeps through the cracks in their shields, and as a result, they suffer severely. Let's briefly survey evidence from the clinic and the lab to see how death fears contribute to and are manifested in different psychological disorders, and then consider the therapeutic implications of conceiving of psychological disorders as terror mismanagement for helping people better manage their terror of death. Schizophrenia, death defied. Schizophrenics like Pat are unable or unwilling to partake of a shared cultural belief system. Subject to bouts of overwhelming terror, schizophrenics construct imaginary worlds which are as real to them as this book is to you, to counteract the dread. These phantasmagorical universes are often peopled with hostile and fearsome forces. When I was psychotic, the main delusion I had was that someone was trying to kill me, wrote an anonymous contributor to the delusion chat room on a website for schizophrenics. I started thinking that it was the mafia, and then everyone I saw on the street became suspicious characters, and I managed to work them into my delusions. Pretty soon, everyone was out to get me. To combat these forces, schizophrenics often have grandiose delusions, imagining themselves as magically omnipotent and physically invulnerable. Some, like Pat, feel that they are on a personal mission to right the wrongs of the world. Schizophrenics thus vacillate between feeling imminently imperiled by malevolent powers and feeling gloriously empowered to thwart them. Pat's dread of death was manifested in his frequent concern about spontaneous combustion or being overtaken by ninjas. But he inflated his self-esteem, aligning himself with the likes of Winston Churchill, JFK, and Bruce Lee. Believing that he was able to defy the laws of nature, Pat felt invincible. His homegrown terror shields temporarily relieved his anxiety. Clinical observations verify that schizophrenics suffer from an overriding fear of or persistent ruminations about death. One study of 205 hospitalized schizophrenic men found that 80 patients were overtly preoccupied with death, and that death fears coincided with the onset of the schizophrenic symptoms or with times when the symptoms were magnified. So when Pat wondered in his journal what truth people were afraid of and whether, quote, they themselves are not what they think themselves to be, he was beating around the psychological bush. In fact, he was getting as close as he could to identifying death as the worm at the core of the human experience, including his own. Schizophrenics, idiosyncratic worldviews, schizophrenics, plural, idiosyncratic worldviews are unlikely to be accepted by others, even if they are no more incredible than the ones to which, quote, normal people subscribe. If you're a schizophrenic and think that ninjas are after you or that you are the president, being routinely rebuffed by others' skeptical disbelief, if not greeted with outright hostility and ridicule, would surely intensify your already daunting psychological difficulties. Phobias and obsessions, death displaced. I'm lying in hospital, shaking with fear, wrote Jesse Houston. There are no familiar faces, only doctors and midwives hovering above me, their mouths moving silently. The contractions keep coming, and I'm horribly confused. How can I be in labor when I would have never allowed myself to get pregnant? Describing this reoccurring nightmare in the UK's Guardian newspaper, Hewitson noted that she first began suffering from tocophobia, or fear of childbirth, during her teenage years when the nightmares began. Some tocophobes think that they will die. Others imagine something unbearable happening, she wrote. For many, the idea of a baby growing inside them is deeply unsettling. When Hewitson became pregnant herself, her terrors grew with every passing month. People like Hewitson suffer from phobias, which are defined as a persistent and excessive fear and avoidance of specific objects, activities, or situations. Intense horror of spiders, snakes, germs, or heights are quite common, though how such specific fears originate is essentially still a mystery. About a century ago, Freud proposed that phobias and obsessions serve to ward off some kind of imagined disaster, at the bottom of which lies death. We suspect Freud was onto something. Unbridled fear of death is overwhelming. Death is always looming and always final. Better to be afraid of something sometimes than everything at all times. So for people suffering from various phobias and obsessions, death fears are channeled into terror of something more controllable, ranging alphabetically from emathophobia, fear of dust, to zemiphobia, fear of the great mole rat. How closely are thoughts of death related to such phobias? Does reminding phobic people of death increase their fear? To find out, we placed an ad in a Colorado Springs newspaper to recruit people who were afraid of spiders, as well as a comparable control group of people who weren't. When the people, those in the control group, were asked, can you tell me generally how you feel about spiders? The most common response was, they just don't bother me. One woman went as far to say, I just love the little furry guys. But arachnophobes definitely met the diagnostic criteria for their phobia. When asked, can you tell me generally how you feel about spiders? The most common response was, I am terrified of them. Others said, I avoid going to parks because there may be spiders there. Or, I could never sleep in a room if I thought a spider had been there. After answering these questions, everyone completed some personality questionnaires, which included the usual essay questions about their mortality for half of the participants. The others wrote about watching television. This was followed by a cognitive processing task in which the participants scrolled through pictures of flowers and spiders at their own rate. Afterward, they reported how dangerous they perceived each spider to be and how likely each spider would attack someone who got close to it. Phobic participants, reminded of their own mortality, spent less time viewing the spiders and reported them to be more dangerous and attack-prone than phobic participants reminded of watching television. Whereas thinking about death had no effect on non-fearful participants' reactions to the spiders. These findings support the general idea that phobias often entail projecting fears of big, uncontrollable concerns like death onto smaller, more manageable problems like spiders. Obsessive compulsive disorder is another prominent anxiety-fueled affliction. People with OCD may constantly wash their hands for fear of contracting germs. Others hoard food, mail, or newspapers for fear that something bad will happen if they throw anything away. Anna, a 35-year-old mother of 3, had reoccurring thoughts that someone had stolen the license plate off of her car. When this happens, I am compelled to check the situation, Anna said. If I don't check it immediately, I worry until I get around to it. Anna's main fear was that someone had taken her tag and blamed her for some hideous crime. She was afraid that this person would tell the police that she'd remove the tag to make the car unidentifiable. Then the police see my car without the tag and assume the tip is for real, she said. The police thinking I am a dangerous criminal, then have to shoot me. If Anna could not check her tag, she suffered terrible panic attacks. Sometimes she would have to get out of bed in the middle of the night to check it. To examine the relationship between OCD and death fears, we asked compulsive hand washers and non-obsessed control participants to complete some personality measures. Half of the participants responded to the standard questions about death. Others were asked to recall a time when other people had shunned them. Then, supposedly to measure nervous system activity, the experimenter dabbed the participants' fingers with sterile electrode cream before attaching the electrodes connected to a physiograph machine, like the one we described in chapter 3. For 2 minutes, described for 2 minutes. Afterward, the electrodes were removed and participants were told that they could wash the goop off their fingers in the lab sink. We unobtrusively recorded how long they spent washing their hands. Compulsive hand washers who had been reminded of death took an especially long time to do this. It appears that OCD participants, like the phobics, were focalizing their fear of death, something beyond their control, onto germs, something that could be more readily avoided. It is probably not particularly surprising that death reminders increase phobic reactions and obsessive behaviors, given that certain spider bites and germs can actually kill you. But what about anxieties that have no direct physical connection to mortality, such as social anxiety disorder? Jim, on his first visit to a clinic, traced his shyness and social anxiety to his early years. I've suffered with this anxiety for as long as I can remember, he said. Even in school, I was backward and I didn't know what to say. After I got married, my wife started taking over all of the daily family responsibilities, and I was more than glad to let her. His wife made every doctor's appointment for their children, went to all the parent-teacher conferences at the school, and managed every social engagement, and even called in the orders for takeout food because Jim was too fearful and shy to use the phone. Jim worked in a small music store that sells CDs, but he was petrified when he had to talk to customers directly. When I have to call up people and tell them that their order is in, he said, I know my voice is going to be weak and break, and I will be unable to get my words out. I'll stumble around and choke up. Then I'll blurt out the rest of my message so fast, I'm afraid they won't understand me. Sometimes I have to repeat myself, and that is excruciatingly embarrassing. Jim found just thinking about going to work or an upcoming social event harrowing and exhausting. For those like Jim with debilitating social anxiety, hell, as French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote, is other people. Because social anxiety disorders generally have to do with self-esteem and feeling valued by others. And as we've seen, thoughts of death intensify the desire to feel worthy. We hypothesize that death thoughts would amplify social anxiety. Imagine being in a study of how personality characters are related to social interaction. Let's say you're Jim, and you and other study participants, selected because they said they had either high or low social anxiety, are each taken to a private cubicle to fill out the usual questionnaires. Some write about death, and others write about feeling intense pain. Afterward, you're told to take as long as you'd like to write anything that you'd like in your cubicle before coming to a larger room to talk with other participants about your hobbies and opinions about current events. The experimenter explains that you can join the others at any time until the end of the hour and points to a clock so you can keep track of time. How much time do you spend in the cubicle writing by yourself before going into the large room? How would being reminded of your death affect your behavior. Our experiment showed that those with social anxiety who wrote about being in intense pain didn't wait any longer to join the group than people who didn't have social anxiety, whether or not they were reminded of pain or death. But people like Jim, who had social anxiety and had written about their mortality, lingered in their cubicles considerably longer. Another common anxiety disorder has to do with food. Because American culture promotes thinness as a basis of worth for girls and women, eating disorders frequently result. Clinicians report that those with eating disorders are often riddled with fear of death. Anorexics tend to view eating as bestial behavior tied to an animal body destined to decay and die. Amy Liu put the association of eating with death most succinctly in a memoir of her experiences with anorexia when she opened a fortune cookie at a sumptuous meal that she read as, "You eat, you die." Is there a demonstrable connection between eating and the fear of death for women? Imagine that you're a female college student on the varsity swim team. You burn a lot of calories every day, and you are usually lean and hungry, but you try to stick to healthful food and the occasional beer. Your psychology professor asks you to participate in a study that involves taste testing some delicious and relatively nutritious, healthful snack foods. A yummy mix of raisins and nuts, yogurt-covered raisins, and chocolate and toffee-covered peanuts. For a marketing study by a national food manufacturer, each bowl of snack food contains 10 grams of tasty stuff. You have 4 minutes to sample and evaluate each product, the experimenter tells you. Eat as much as you'd like. Then the experimenter leaves the room. Normally, you would wolf down the yogurt-covered raisins, which just happens to be your favorite snack food. But moments before you were invited to taste the snacks, you had to answer standard questions regarding your feelings about death. Your snacking neighbor had to think about dental pain. How much would you eat? As it turned out, the men and women who thought about pain ate the same amount from the 10-gram snack bowls. But after thinking about death, the women ate 40% less. And the death-primed men, they ate as much as their pain-primed counterparts. Death thoughts apparently drove women to seek to meet the cultural ideal of thinness. Fascinating. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the shield shattered. In March 2004, Mike Nashif set out from Fort Hood for Iraq to scout enemy targets in one of the most war-torn areas of southern Baghdad. Mike and his team went on nightly missions checking houses for weapons or enemy combatants, or patrolling the area in Bradley fighting vehicles or Humvees. The vehicles were being hit or nearly hit at least once a week by improvised explosive devices, IEDs. Once, a 250-pound bomb blew up in a parked car as he drove by. When the bomb went off, Mike told the reporter, "You feel it, you smell it, and you taste it. It's one big beat on your body. It's like somebody slapping you very hard on both sides of your body. You feel it on your toes, chest, head, fingers, all over your body." When a buddy was killed by an IED, Mike spent 4 hours cleaning his mangled friend's blood and tissue from the salvaged radio gear inside the Humvee. A sadder, more gruesome job is difficult to imagine. After he returned to the States, Mike suffered from migraines, nightmares, memory lapses, anxiety, and hypervigilance. He became increasingly disengaged from his wife and children. "It was like I was standing outside my house, watching my family through a window," he said. But it was quickly enraged when he felt crossed or disobeyed. When his oldest son wouldn't stop badgering his brother, Mike grabbed him by the throat and held him against the wall. Another time, he picked up a baseball bat and smashed one of his son's monster trucks to pieces in the living room. Eventually, his marriage fell apart, and he was allowed to see his children only every other weekend. Like others who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, Mike experienced the terror of death in its most immediate elemental form. Military psychologists estimate that from 17 to 25% of American soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan return with some form of PTSD. For others, earthquakes and hurricanes, terrorist attacks, or violent personal assaults, such as rape or domestic violence, can trigger the disorder. Regardless of how it happens, people with PTSD have been so traumatized by one or more catastrophic events that their sense of reality is shaken to its core, like having the roof of the old house described in the last chapter to represent distal defenses blown off in a storm, leaving them vulnerable to buffeting waves of nightmares, flashbacks, severe anxiety and panic, and uncontrollable thoughts. Mike's feeling that he was standing outside his own life, watching it through a window, is typical of PTSD sufferers. When facing the prospect of annihilation and feeling powerless to fight or flee, people often blank out. Things seem to happen in slow motion. They feel disconnected from their body as they watch themselves from a distance, as if they are in a dream or at a movie. They feel confused and unable to clearly make out what's going on. In psychological terms, this state is known as dissociation. Because the person disassociates himself or herself from the dreadful encounter, for those unable to physically escape, dissociation provides a psychological exodus from the horror of the traumatic event. Dissociation makes the unbearable less unbearable, at least in the short run. But it also prevents people from coming to terms with their traumatic experiences. People who dissociate during a traumatic event are more prone to subsequently develop PTSD. Therefore, they feel perpetually endangered and are always anxious and on the lookout for hazards. They repeatedly relive the original trauma in vivid flashbacks while awake and terrifying nightmares while asleep. To cope with chronic anxiety and relentless recollections of the original trauma, PTSD victims often enter a protracted, dissociated state that clinicians call psychic numbing, often aided by heavy use of alcohol and other drugs. Research confirms that concerns about death underlie dissociation in reaction to trauma. Individuals who experience intense fear of death during a traumatic event are especially likely to dissociate and subsequently develop PTSD. In 2005, New York college students reminded their mortality and then asked to recall how they felt during the 9/11 terrorist attacks or when they watched the video footage of the attacks, reported greater dissociative reactions compared to a control group of students who thought about being in pain or an upcoming exam. These dissociative reactions, in turn, led to more anxieties about the future. Another study tracked people who had survived a devastating earthquake in Zaheran, Iran in 2005, in which more than 700 people perished and almost 7,000 had to evacuate their homes. Survivors of the quake undoubtedly experienced the severe trauma. When reminded of their own death or the earthquake a few months later, survivors who did not dissociate in the aftermath of the earthquake responded without anxiety. They instead tended to express negativity toward foreigners, an unfortunate but typical defensive reaction to managed terror. Those survivors who did dissociate during the earthquake, when reminded of the events months later, reported a great deal of anxiety and did not express antipathy toward foreigners. Interesting stuff, yeah. The usual means of terror management, bolstering one's own group at the expense of others was apparently unavailable to the survivors who had disassociated. And 2 years later, these high disassociators were far more likely to have developed PTSD than those who had not dissociated. Similar results have been found for Polish soldiers returning from the war in Afghanistan and survivors of a civil war in the Ivory Coast. Although most everyone experiences some anxiety in response to life-threatening traumas, most people don't dissociate to a maladaptive extent or develop PTSD. There is much yet to be learned about what makes people resilient in the face of these threats, but we do know that a strong sense of the meaningfulness of life and of one's own value in society provides shields against such mortal terror. Depression, death visible. So far, we've seen that schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, and PTSD are, at least in part, maladaptive responses to mortal terror. But what about depression, the common cold of psychological woes, which afflicts approximately 16% of the adult population of the United States in a given year? The shadows of nightfall seemed more somber. My mornings were less buoyant. Walks in the wood became less zestful, William Styrone recalled. And there was a moment during my working hours in the late afternoon when a kind of panic and anxiety overtook me, accompanied by a visceral queasiness. His formerly friendly, lively old house felt ominous. Sleep was a blessing that never occurred except in small increments or with the help of an addictive sleeping aids. He lost all sense of self-worth. He nearly stopped talking. He could barely function. Such was the torture suffered by the brilliant writer of great novels such as The Confessions of Nat Turner and Sophie's Choice. Styrone felt that he was accompanied by a second self who is able to watch with dispassionate curiosity as his companion struggles against the oncoming disaster, and that his brain became an instrument registering minute by minute varying degrees of its own suffering. He felt his mind slowly drowning, like one of those outmoded small-town telephone exchanges being gradually inundated by floodwaters. One by one, the normal circuits began to drown, causing some of the functions of the body and nearly all of those of instinct and intellect to disconnect. Determined to shed light on the curse of severe depression, a condition familiar to many creative artists and writers, Styrone sat down in writing detail his own experiences in a 1989 Vanity Fair essay and 1990 book, Darkness Visible, whose name he borrowed from John Milton's Vision of Hell. A dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover the sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can never dwell, hope never comes, that comes to all, but torture without end. In his unstinting portrayal of depression, Styrone made it clear that extreme depression is a form of madness. People who are depressed are generally dissatisfied with life and see little value in either themselves or the world in which they live. They tend to dwell on gloomy and death-related thoughts that are likely to prolong and exacerbate their state of depression, and they have difficulties perceiving purpose and meaning in life. Depression sometimes results from specific events. If someone close to you dies, for example, or if you get terribly ill, or you lose your job. Other times, depression creeps up on people for no discernible reason. But regardless of how depression arises, Mortal musings and doubts about life's meaning and one's own significance clearly contribute to a downward spiral of anxiety and despair. And regardless of the cause, depressed people no longer confidently subscribe to their cultural scheme of things or believe themselves to be valuable members of their culture. Given their tenuous faith in the meaningfulness of life and their own self-worth, we suspected that depressed people would be especially vulnerable to death reminders. Although it would be unethical to induce severely depressed people to think about their mortality, we conducted some studies with mildly depressed individuals. While depressed Americans are generally less demonstrative in their support of America than their compatriots, we found that after a death reminder, mildly depressed people became even more nationalistic than their fellow citizens. And after being jolted into defending their culture by a reminder of their mortality, the mildly depressed people reported that life was more meaningful. Very interesting. These findings suggest that although the mildly depressed are generally unable to obtain sufficient meaning and self-esteem from their worldviews to muster much zest for life, they have not forsaken their worldviews entirely. However, we suspect that severely depressed people, like those suffering from PTSD, have probably completely abandoned their cultural scheme of things. Suicide, death enacted. As we saw with the anguished schizophrenic Pat, and is particularly common in response to depression, and as is particularly common in response to depression, mental agony sometimes leads to suicide attempts. But why would people hasten the very event that terrifies them, one we all spend most of our lives ardently avoiding? Some suicides are attempted and completed simply because physical or psychological pain is so great that death seems like the only relief. In many of these cases, drugs and alcohol are used to dampen the dread to make the act possible. Other suicide attempts are not intended to succeed, but rather intended to elicit help or some reaction from others. However, many suicides, rather ironically, result from the horror of mortality itself. Why bother to go on living when death will get you anyway? The majority of suicides, wrote the great Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno, would not take their lives if they had the assurance that they would never die on this earth. The self-slayer kills himself because he will not wait for death. That's fascinating right there. Dostoevsky came to a similar conclusion in The Possessed, in which the character Stepanovich explained his impending suicide. I wish to deprive myself of life because I do not want to have the fear of death. And then there is the ancient wish for literal immortality. People who commit suicide often generally believe that they will outlive their own death. Even children who kill themselves seem to feel this way. Clinical studies find suicidal children are more likely than non-suicidal children to view death as a continuation of life in which long-standing wishes may be fulfilled. And many share Shakespeare's Cleopatra's idea that in dying, they will walk through the door to either literal or symbolic immortality or both. Give me my robe, put on my crown, she proclaimed as she took up a venomous snake. I have immortal longings in me. That's Cleopatra. In certain instances, suicide is part of a culturally approved script. Devoutly religious people sometimes book their own passage from a transient earthly existence to a heavenly afterlife. Early Christianity had an annual commemoration of eager and willing martyrs to celebrate their birthday to immortality. In traditional Japanese culture, death transcendence is derived from being part of an immortal ancestral lineage that extends long into the past and projects indefinitely into the future. Committing harakiri, ritual suicide by disembowelment, can atone for dishonorable behavior and restore a valued place in the ancestral line. Similar practices continue to this day in various cultures. Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers in the September 11, 2001 attack on the World Trade Center, left a note behind stating, "Pledge allegiance to die. Understand what God has prepared for the faithful. He prepared an everlasting paradise for the martyrs. Immortality to die for." Research verifies that death fears contribute to suicidal acts when they can be viewed as heroic efforts to serve one's God or country. As noted in Chapter 7, Iranian students were more interested in becoming suicidal martyrs after thinking about dying. Death reminders also increased British citizens' reported willingness to die for this blessed plot, this earth, this England. So in a variety of contexts, suicides provide a path to literal or symbolic immortality. Alcohol and other drugs, death diffused. While suicide is an extreme and irrevocable way to flee the terror and miseries of mortal life, alcohol and other drugs provide a much more common, albeit momentary mode of escape. Ritualistic use of psychoactive substances has been and remains prevalent in virtually all cultures from time immemorial. Children everywhere enjoy spinning around and rolling down hills to make themselves dizzy, suggesting that humans have an innate fondness for alterations of the consciousness. I did that too, yeah. People enjoy catching a buzz. An occasional spiritual, recreational, or medical use of drugs and alcohol does not necessarily cause enduring harm and may even have beneficial effects. People use drugs for many reasons: to feel good, amplify sensory and sensual experiences, alleviate pain, boost energy, increase feelings of power and self-worth, stimulate creativity, enhance social and spiritual connections, and to manage terror. It's certainly not a newsflash that some people resort to drugs to escape reality and subdue anxieties. By and large, people who lack sufficient meaning and self-worth are most prone to becoming addicted to drugs rather than using them in moderation. Although each psychoactive substance has its own unique biochemical effects, they all can serve to manage terror by reducing the capacity to experience anxiety, dimming self-awareness, distorting perceptions, and altering one's sense of the flow of time. Recall from the last chapter how people drank more alcohol after thinking about their mortality? Recent studies show that reminders of death increase smoking as well. To demonstrate that addictive behaviors are magnified in reaction to reminders of death, Jamie Arndt and his colleagues had cigarette smokers come into the lab for a study examining basic personality and smoking behaviors. First, participants responded to questions to determine if they were dependent on nicotine. For example, they rated their agreement with statements such as, "I have a desire for a cigarette right now," and "I could control things better right now if I could smoke," and reported how soon after waking up they smoked their first cigarette and whether they smoked even if they were so ill that they were in bed most of the day. Participants were then given a cigarette of their favorite brand, and they took 5 puffs while connected to a gadget that measured how much they inhaled, how long each puff lasted, and how fast they inhaled. Next, participants pondered either their own mortality or the prospect of failing an upcoming exam. Finally, everyone got one of their favorite cigarettes and took another 5 puffs while hooked up to the gadget. The findings were striking. After thinking about death, the highly addictive smokers puffed harder, longer, and faster to jack up the amount of nicotine they inhaled. Other activities such as gambling serve a similar function to drugs and can become problematic when people engage in them compulsively to reduce anxiety, obliterate self-awareness, obtain a momentary surge of self-esteem, and dampen existential dread. Video game addiction has become a particularly serious concern in recent years. Gamers are seduced by the allure of a fantasy world in which they can attain a sense of heroism and, importantly, in which death is not permanent. Avatars can have infinite lives. If you do die, just start again. Although, as with all addictions, there are multiple forces at work, pathological gambling and gaming-like results, in part from a flight from terror of mortal life. Mending the cracks in the shields. Schizophrenia, phobias, obsession, social anxiety, eating disorders, PTSD, depression, suicide, and addiction surely have multiple and distinct underlying causes. Individuals suffering from one or more of these conditions are consequently well served by a variety of biochemical, behavioral, and psychosocial interventions. But mental health practitioners and the rest of us should be mindful of how the fear of death contributes to and aggravates various psychological disorders in order to cultivate additional ways to help those in need. Existential approaches to psychotherapy developed by clinicians such as Otto Rank, Viktor Frankl, R.D. Laing, Rollo May, and Irvin Yalom address the role of death anxiety and related existential concerns in the etiology and treatment of psychological disorders. The core principle of existential psychotherapy have been mostly fully articulated by Yalom in his aptly titled 1980 book, Existential Psychotherapy. Yalom begins by asserting that there is no specific set of techniques employed in existential psychotherapy. Rather, existential psychotherapists emphasize the importance of treating each of their clients as a unique individual and developing deep and authentic relationships with them. This entails becoming intimately acquainted with the client's worldview, personal strivings, and social connections, and encouraging the client to get to know the therapist as a unique individual who, like all humans, is not immune to broad existential concerns and his own personal psychological difficulties. The therapist also stresses human freedom and responsibility, that there is an element of choice in just about everything that people do, and that our choices have consequences that we are accountable for. A strong, genuine relationship braced by a sense of freedom and responsibility lays the groundwork for helping the client shore up her terror management resources while tackling the three most common presenting existential difficulties: meaninglessness, isolation, and death. To address the problem of meaninglessness, existential psychotherapists seek to grasp how the client has derived or seeks to derive meaning in the world. These meanings can be inadequately formed in youth or undermined in adulthood because of a host of challenges, including neurological impairments, biochemical imbalances, harsh or chaotic upbringing, traumatic experiences, awareness of alternative belief systems, discomfort with our bodies and carnal desires, economic upheaval, betrayal by or loss of loved ones, and physical ailments. And this often results in the tenuous meanings of those suffering from various psychological disorders. The grandiose schizophrenic claims to consort with JFK and defy the laws of nature, or adheres to other idiosyncratic and unsustainable delusions. The obsessive compulsive becomes preoccupied with stepping over the cracks in the sidewalk or flushing the toilet 3 times after urinating. In short, focusing on meanings too narrow and symbolically impoverished to afford a sense of significance. That's a very key too narrow and symbolically impoverished to afford a sense of significance. The depressive's gradual and the PTSD sufferer's more abrupt disillusionment are triggered and largely by abandonment or obliteration of meaning entirely. Regardless of the specific challenges to meaning, existential therapy focuses on helping individuals reaffirm previous meanings, modify existing beliefs to render them more compelling and sustainable, or fashion entirely new meanings. A sense of meaninglessness often results from the clients taking a galactic view of the world in which all cultural-based meanings fall away, leaving only an absurd, indifferent universe in its wake. That's kind of like nihilism or pessimism. No self-respecting existentialist psychotherapist would argue that life has any inherent or ultimate meaning. Instead, she would try to bring the client down to a less grand perspective on life by encouraging the person to focus on what matters to him in his life. Yalom uses the example of the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer to illustrate this phenomenological shift. In his philosophical treatise, Schopenhauer argued that nothing matters in the grand scheme of an absurd, indifferent universe. Consequently, nothing is worth striving for. But Schopenhauer was personally bothered by this, which means that it mattered to him that there seemed to be no meaning or purpose in life. Further, it was clearly important to Schopenhauer, rather ironically, to convince others that nothing mattered. And he continued to produce philosophical works until the end of his life instead of committing suicide. That evidently mattered to him as well. So Yalom notes, once individuals relinquish their intellectualized galactic view of existence, there are virtually always aspects of life that do matter to them. The therapist's goal is thus to help clients find those meanings and orient them toward engaging in activities that serve to bolster and affirm them. Such meanings would then serve as a durable foundation for obtaining and maintaining self-esteem. Infused with a new or renewed sense of meaning and value, individuals can better distinguish between who they are and who other people expect them to be, and clarify what they want for themselves. They can then act on their desires, willing, in existential parlance, making more mature and courageous choices about their current and future concerns, as well as coming to terms with maladaptive choices in the past, and taking greater responsibility for their decisions. Dealing with feelings of existential isolation is a second frequent goal in existential psychotherapy. Recall from Chapter 2 that parental affection provides profoundly immature and anxiety-prone infants with a sense of safety and security. That's psychological security, right? Thereafter, close relationships with friends, family, and significant others based on a mutual affection, trust, and respect serve the same function. Indeed, thinking of loved ones reduces or eliminates the defensive reactions that death reminders typically evoke. And thinking about a close relationship being disrupted or dissolved brings death thoughts closer to consciousness. Accordingly, helping people forge new social bonds, fortifying existing connections, and restore estranged relationships is often a high priority on the existential therapeutic agenda. Robust interpersonal relationships serve to bolster faith in the cultural scheme of things and help individuals obtain and maintain self-esteem. However, if a client asserts that he or she is ultimately isolated and alone, existential psychotherapists generally will not take issue with that contention. This is because we are all, according to the existentialists, ultimately isolated from our fellow humans, in that we can never communicate with them directly. only indirectly through words and other symbols that, despite their great power, never enable us to completely know another person or be known by another person. We come into contact with others only through our exteriors, Becker explained. Yet each of us walks about with great wealth of interior life. We are hopelessly separated from everyone else. We touch people on the outsides of their bodies and they us, but we cannot get at their insides and cannot reveal our insides to them. Even the best relationships cannot fully bridge this gap, no matter how close they are. Often, as Becker put it, we want to say something unusually intimate to a spouse, a parent, a friend, communicate something of how we are really feeling about a sunset, who we really feel we are, only to fall strangely and miserably flat. In existential psychotherapy, clients are helped to come to accept this undeniable truth. Only then can they come to understand what can and cannot be obtained from their relationships with other human beings. If you go into a relationship wanting the other person to know you fully, you will inevitably be disappointed and frustrated. By trying to use another person to overcome existential isolation, people are seeking too much and therefore often end up getting too little. Once a person understands what a relationship with another person cannot provide, the person can begin to focus on the positive things that they can provide. The key to forging good relationships that reduce feelings of existential isolation and loneliness is to have the goal of getting to know another person rather than the goal of meeting your own needs. And the therapist's relationship with a client should ideally serve as a model of what that endeavor looks like. Yalom, following Austrian-born Israeli philosopher Martin Buber, calls it an I-thou relationship rather than an I-it one. By getting to know someone as a whole person rather than a need fulfiller, you can come to realize that the other person as just as ultimately alone as you are. But you now have that in common. Once you accept the limited knowledge you can have of each other, you can then feel close to and love someone and be loved by them. Love doesn't eliminate all divides between people, but it allows one to value and be valued and to feel connected to another person who is in the same existential boat that you are in, thereby minimizing feelings of anxiety and loneliness. Existential psychotherapists recognize that although clients are sometimes consciously troubled by death, they are more often unaware that inadequate defenses against death anxiety are contributing to their difficulties. Therefore, the therapeutic focus is typically on helping the client shore up her terror management resources, her sense that life is meaningful, her self-worth, and her sense of connectedness to other people. But for those clients for whom mortality is consciously viewed as troubling or problematic, existential psychotherapy is devoted to helping them come to terms with their mortality. The fleeting reminders of death we encounter on a daily basis instigate proximal defenses to banish death thoughts from consciousness, followed by distal defenses to shore up faith in the cultural scheme of things and boost self-esteem. The ongoing operation of these defenses keeps existential terror at bay, but it does not foster coming to terms with mortality. This requires a more sustained and intentional, emotionally arduous and tumultuous confrontation and eventually acceptance of the simple fact, as psychoanalyst Harold Searles portrayed it, the simple fact that for every individual, the whole complex business of living, this whole fascinating, agonizing, thrilling, boring, reassuring, and frightening business with all its moments of simple peace and complex turmoil, will someday inescapably end. To facilitate acceptance of this fact, existential psychotherapists sometimes guide clients through sustained contemplation of death and efforts to desensitize them to it. Consistent with this approach, people who have had close brushes with death and elderly folks who acknowledge their remaining time on earth is waning report a greater appreciation of the present moment, place more importance on close relationships than material possessions, and report being less fearful and defensive about their own mortality. Just quickly here, people close brushes with death and the elderly are less fearful and defensive about their own mortality. This, of course, raises the question of whether it's possible to foster acceptance of one's finitude in the absence of mortal danger and old age. And if so, how? And if so, how? Questions that we will address further in our final chapter. Fear of death is universal, albeit with varying degrees of awareness. Most of us are shielded from existential terror by embracing a cultural scheme of things and striving for self-esteem. We all have some cracks, or at least some dings, in our terror management shields, resulting in a host of suboptimal attitudes and behaviors. In this sense, many of us are good candidates for existential psychotherapy. And all of us, even paragons of psychological well-being, are destined to die. It behooves us all, therefore, to consider how to make the best of living with death. And next week, the final chapter, Living with Death. This is where the authors will give some really good ideas on how to cope, how to come to terms with your mortality, how do you deal with this stuff? All this talk about, we're fearful. We know the knowledge of our death drives these crazy things in us. We act out. A lot of us do really malignant type, really bad stuff because of it. Because most of us aren't conscious of it. So how do we overcome this? How do you do, as Albert Camus said, come to terms with death? How do you come to terms with your mortality? Chapter 11, the final chapter in the book next week, called Living with Death, they talk about that and they lay some things out. And I've come to realize, I just wrote a little blog essay, I think it was yesterday that I published it, called What Will They Think? And it's basically just thoughts on symbolic immortality and understanding my finitude, understanding my pursuit of creating art, and what people will think of me, and what will they think of my art in 100 or 1,000 years. They won't think of me, and my art will mean nothing, is the short answer of it. But so why would I do that? Why would I pursue that? That's what I talk about in this essay. And I also talk about, in terms of living with death, I also talk about what Solomon, and I'm probably going to email him and see if we can't get him back on this, come back for another visit after we finish this book. But I also talk about some of the things Sheldon has talked about a lot, humility and gratitude, and being conscious and being aware of your life and all the great things in it. We all have our problems, we all have our issues, but that's the thing we deal with. This is interesting. I didn't see this, Linda. Ironically, the Danish word for graveyard is Kierkegaard. Oh, good Lord. Okay, well, there you go. Soren, yeah, he definitely knew that. He was a Danish. He's very, if you haven't read Kierkegaard, in the School of Anxiety, he's very profound. Although he takes the approach of death anxiety and dealing with mortality through faith, through his religion. And there's no problem with that to my mind, as long as it doesn't end up in, what typically religion has ended up in over the last 2 or 3 millennia. But Kierkegaard is profound. I don't know that there's any modern psychologist, sociologist, anthropologist, anybody that doesn't mention him or is very familiar with him. Becker talks about him a lot. Heidegger, any of them. He was in the mid 19th century. But so next week, this idea of living with all this death anxiety, living with all this knowledge, and here's the bottom line of it. So typically, a human being is born. We have that psychological security. Hopefully, when we're young, we're taught by our parents our symbols and our culture and maybe a religion, maybe whatever it is, all that, the cultural scheme of things, or developing our cultural worldview. So we learn all of that. Then we break off from our parents generally, and then our culture takes over and tells us how we can bolster our self-esteem. So as children, we do it to satisfy our parents. That's how we get self-esteem. And then we break away and our culture gives us. And self-esteem buffers, represses that death anxiety. So we're not anxious all the time. It pushes it back into our subconscious, unconscious. So that's what that does. Now, Solomon calls that a culturally constructed meat puppet. So when you're going through life and you're just fulfilling I don't think about death, and you're just kind of going through it. You're winning the prize and you're getting your exhibition in the gallery, and you're getting the promotion at work, and you've got the new car. You don't think about death. Of course not. You're completely enveloped in that, and you're a culturally constructed meat puppet. You're just, the culture is dangling your arms, and they got the control of the strings, and they're doing their thing. That's okay in one sense. It's okay in one sense, in that as long as you're not pursuing maladaptive or bad things to bolster your self-esteem, that's fine. But the problem with that is at some point in your life, you may come and wake up and understand that you really haven't thought or confronted death in a way. Now you're paralyzed by it because you get an illness or old age or whatever it might be. You haven't confronted death. And that culturally constructed meat puppet is going to have a really difficult time dealing with it. Nietzsche, Becker, some others talk about the authentic man or woman. That is, and Kierkegaard also talks about that. That is a person that comes to terms with their death, comes to terms with mortality, and are able to break away from gathering their self-esteem from the culture, right? Getting the new car, the big job, the gallery exhibition, the 1,000 likes on social media, however you get those dopamine hits and bolster your self-esteem. You break away from that and you find really healthy ways, non-narcissistic ways to bolster your self-esteem. And that has a lot to do with humility and gratitude, seem to be a great anti death anxiety buffers. They work really well. How do you employ those? That's for a whole nother talk. But to start with, you become aware and you deal with the psychological phenomenon of death, our fear of death, and how it drives us. And that's the most fascinating thing to me, is how much the fear, the knowledge of our death, that we're going to die, drives human behavior. And it's 99% you're not conscious of it. Most people are completely, I didn't do that for that reason. I didn't vote for that person, or I don't dislike this person for that reason. They don't even know it's happening. That's very interesting and very frightening all at once. So to become aware of this, self-awareness, Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living. What he's talking about there is this is what he's talking about, is understanding the human condition. And it's a paradox, no doubt. I find the book interesting, and I have always been interested in people's behavior. Me too. That's exactly what my whole life I have been. When I get out of this, that it shows that people really don't go around thinking, they don't. Exactly, they don't. As many as in many of these studies, they had to be reminded of their death to act or think differently. Even it feels subconsciously the fear of death is just, yes, it is. So here, that's a good point, Linda. Here's the issue, though. And you're right. In these control groups, right, there's the control group, and then there's the people that are reminded about their death, the other group, the death reminders, and the control group. The control group is not reminded of their death, and they respond differently. They respond less aggressive. They don't eat as many yogurt covered raisins, whatever, or they eat more, whatever it is, right? They eat the same amount. So the difference in those two, one's reminded, one's not. But remember back, just here not too long ago, Death Near and Far, the chapter we just read, remember back how we're reminded of death every day. I guarantee you were reminded of death today, whether you know it or not. You were reminded of death today in some way. So that begs the question. So if we're constantly reminded about death, and we have to interact and do certain things through our lives and our world, how is that impacting those decisions that we make? How does it impact how we think about this person who is different from me? How does it impact who I'm going to vote for in the next election? How does it impact how I'm going to drive, if I'm going to smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol? Or how is it going to impact all of those things? It does. It impacts those things. So this is why they say death anxiety is so pervasive in human behavior. It does drive. See, back in the day, Freud pinned everything on our sexual drive, right? Our need to procreate. So sex was at the core of Freud. Freud's been debunked in a lot of ways. I mean, there's still some good things about Freud, no doubt. But Becker said, no, Freud got that wrong. It's not sexual desire. Our sexual procreation and our drive for sex. It's not that. It's death, the knowledge that we're going to die. That's what drives human behavior for the most part. And if you really think deeply about this stuff, you will come to realize not only yourself, but observe people and think, be an observer, do your own little clinical study, if you will, and watch how people think about what they do, think about situations, movies, and some of the television series, and some art. A lot of art is driven by these ideas unconsciously, but you can pick those things out. And as you study this more, you start to gain this appreciation that Becker was profoundly accurate. Becker was, and then Solomon, Greenberg, and Pyszczynski just gave it the empirical evidence that support these theories, and it just comes full circle. And I think artists can benefit from these ideas in tremendous ways, creative people. I don't care if you sculpt, you write, you make photographs, you paint, whatever you do, however you express yourself. You can not only incorporate them into your own personal, your own psychological understanding yourself, your behavior, but then you can express things around you through the art. Like I just went in that same essay that I just wrote, I talk about Peter Wessel, Zappa. I talk about Zappa and his The Last Messiah, that essay. And he talks about sublimation as one: isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation are his 4 ways human beings deflect death anxiety. And sublimation is he says it's the most rare, because you generally have to have skills, but not always. But it's creating art and projecting your anxiety onto and through your artwork to get rid of it. So that's why a lot of times artists, people struggle mentally, like they just talked about in this chapter. There's a lot of depression, anxiety, and a lot of mental health issues with artists. And we can have this conversation at some point, but I think that's because a lot of times artists are emotionally, they're empathetic, they're more sensitive to things. They're built their mind thinks and acts in just in a little bit different way, and it kind of takes the veil away. It kind of takes some of that cultural construction away, and they see the man behind the curtain, right? A little bit. And so they want to express these ideas and things. And it says, yes, I'm reminded every day. I love the psychological aspect about how, yes, I do too, how we think we know what we think. Yes, I do. That's exactly right. When we think we don't know what we think about. Exactly. So all of this, we got you, Linda. All of this, most psychological activities, most human behavior is done in the unconscious, the majority of it. So the things you do are driven by something. And we put a label on top of it to say, this is why we do it. But really, it's something deeper. And Becker and Solomon, Pyszczynski and Greenberg all say, and a lot of psychoanalysts, psychologists, and philosophers, it's driven by the knowledge of our death. We're in this paradoxical condition, this human condition, this disinclination to die, this survival instinct, and the knowledge that we're going to die. We want to live, but we know we're going to die. Creates tremendous amount of psychological weight. As Solomon says, it's a psychological kick in the groin to know that. So anyway, I appreciate everyone joining me today. Thanks for hanging in there with me. One more chapter and we're finished. And this next chapter gives you some ideas of how to deal with all this knowledge, how to deal with all the psychological chaos of death anxiety and the knowledge of death. So I hope you can join me. Boguslav, thanks for hanging in there with me today. I appreciate it. You have a great day, evening, whenever you're watching this, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks, Linda, Thilo, Fred. We'll see you next week. And I hope Beth got to listen to this today too. So ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.